Starwalker Studios presents the Obsidian Monolith, creating an original campaign for Numenera.
Greetings, Numenerian, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Obsidian Monolith. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I've got some basic ideas laid out for the campaign, so today I start thinking about the first adventure. I'll also have some thoughts on how I actually run a game of Numenera. So grab a pen, grab some paper, and get your creative juices going. It's time to create an adventure. Hello, listener. Welcome back to the Obsidian Monolith. I'm so excited to be recording another episode of this podcast. I thought I would do something a little bit different this podcast. I have, as you know, been talking about creating a campaign for Numenera, which is a series of adventures and stories tied together into a larger story, and is something that will probably take you from tier 1 to tier maybe 5 or 6, I don't know, and will involve months of playing. So this is a, long-term endeavor. This is not a one-shot or a few sessions or something like that. And it's become obvious to me that I may be giving some people a not 100% accurate impression of how I actually prepare for games and how I run games because of this podcast and all these things I'm talking about. So this is, again, for a campaign. So this is involving a lot of world building. I'm not only coming up with adventures for the characters to play, but I'm actually trying to come up with a lot of setting stuff, because as you know, the setting of the ninth world that's given to us is very much the broad strokes of the setting. And as a GM, it is your job to take the area where your story is going to take place and to flesh it out, because, those broad strokes aren't enough. And you might be some kind of improvisational genius like Jim Walls, and you can just do it off the cuff. But for most of us, we're going to want to give some thought to it ahead of time to figure those things out so that everything fits together well, and one thing leads to another, and we don't end up in any situations where a PC or a player in our game says, yeah, but what about this? And we're like, oh, crap. Which is what happens a lot to me when I do things on the fly. Is I may come up with something that deals very well with the current situation, but I don't necessarily always think of all the consequences of that or all the ways it interacts with everything else I've come up with. And then a player finds some contradiction in something or some weird interaction that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I have to come up with some way to explain that. And I've learned in the past that when I look back on those, I'm often not happy with the solution I came up with, because I had to come up with it on the spot and I didn't have a lot of time to think about it. And I'm often finding myself thinking, if I could have had some time to think about that, I would have come up with something a lot better. And now I'm doing damage control. So I am I'm putting my process under a microscope for you to try to explain to a new GM or a GM who's run only published stuff how you can create your own campaign, and how you can not only create an adventure, but create a series of adventures that connect together and form a whole story. One of the bases One of the reasons I did this podcast was because I saw more than one question online from new GMs who were like, I want to run these different published adventures, or I have some ideas for some adventures of my own I want to run. But what I don't understand is, how do I get the PCs from adventure A to adventure B? How do I connect the adventures together? And that is why I decided to do a podcast about making a campaign as opposed to a podcast about making one-shot adventures, because they're very, very different things. I think because of the fact that A, I'm talking about a campaign, B, I'm trying to make a campaign that all of my listeners can play or run if they want to. So I'm trying to appeal to a lot of people. And I'm putting my process under a microscope and going into depth about things that maybe I just do really quickly and don't necessarily think about as much as it sounds like I think about it when I explain it to you. Because of all those reasons, it's kind of, I think, giving you or some of you a kind of not exactly accurate view of what I'm actually doing when I prepare for a game. So I thought I would start out this episode by talking a little bit about how do I prepare for an actual session of Numenera. And how do I run a session of Numenera? Because that is another question or a couple of questions that I see asked a lot in the communities. So the first thing I want to point out is I don't usually come up with a plot per se. Rather, what I try to do is I come up with a situation or a conflict that the PCs will be involved in, but I leave it up to the players to figure out how they're going to deal with that. I don't sit there and write out, every possible solution I can think of that the players might come up with and then decide what I'm going to do for each of those. Like I don't do that. And after talking to Jim on the show a couple episodes ago, I think now that I'm a lot more of a sandbox GM than I realized. I never considered myself a sandbox GM, but after talking to Jim and some of the other listeners about sandbox GMing versus non-sandbox GMing, I've come to realize that I actually am in a lot of ways a sandbox GM because I do a lot of prep of my setting and my NPCs. I don't so much prep plots. So let me get into that a bit. So like I said, I don't come up with a plot. I set up a situation or a conflict that will involve the PCs. And then I may come up with a few possibilities of what I think they might do and think about what the consequences, like if they do A, what will happen? If they do B, what will happen? But this isn't so much an effort to try to anticipate everything the PCs might do, because no matter how many of these things I come up with, they almost always end up doing something completely different that I didn't come up with, or some different permutation of something I came up with that changes things quite a lot. So I'm not doing this to try to anticipate what they're going to do and figure out how I'm going to react to that ahead of time. It's more of a mental exercise to wrap my brain around the situation and the possible solutions to the situation to just kind of get a feel for the different way things will go. So I don't know if that makes sense, but again, I'm not trying to say, okay, A is going to happen and then B is going to happen and C is going to happen. I'm just trying to get a feel for the situation, put myself in it and say, well, if I was in this situation, what are some of the things I might do? And some of those things I come up with might be things I want to prepare for if it seems like it's a fairly obvious, first thing the PCs might try kind of thing. And I'm going to give an example at the end of this that will, I think, make this all make more sense. But I don't try to steer the PCs in any particular direction. Like if I come up with maybe 3 different ways I could see it going, I'm not trying to steer the PCs in one of those ways. I fully expect that they're going to do something completely different. And those things I come up with are just for me to kind of get my juices going and kind of get my brain used to coming up with consequences of different things, different reactions to the situation. It's not me trying to say, okay, this is the way I want the PCs to solve the problem, because that's their job to figure out. So let me go into how I prepare a session. And this actually is pretty much the same whether I'm running something I came up with myself or if I'm running a published adventure. I know a lot of people say or think that running a published adventure takes less prep time than coming up with an adventure yourself. But in my experience, that isn't true. And I think that that prepping for a published adventure takes at least as long as one you came up with yourself. And I think a lot of times, at least for me, it takes longer. And the reason I say this is if you look at, if you've come up with adventures in the past, if you look at your process, or I look at my process, it goes something like this. I start thinking, okay, I need to come up with an adventure. And I start with, as I've talked about on the show in previous episodes, I start with just ideas. And I generate some ideas and I find some that fit together in interesting ways. And then boom, I've got the basis to start building my adventure. And that step right there is the only added step in my prep as opposed to running a published adventure. And that step doesn't usually take very long. I mean, at the longest, maybe half an hour or an hour, but a lot of times it takes 10 or 15 minutes and boom, I've got my idea for the adventure. I'm ready to go from there. And that's also something that you can do anytime, anywhere, right? You can think about this while you're on the subway or while you're driving your car or while you're waiting in line for a coffee or whatever. And you can very easily and very quickly come up with these ideas. And from that point on, the prep for me is the same, whether I'm doing a publish or an adventure I came up with myself. So I think this idea that, published adventures take less or no prep, I think is not true unless you're literally trying to run an adventure out of the box, which I don't recommend and I don't think is going to create as good an experience for your players as you could. So let me talk a little bit more about why I say that, because the reason is, for me personally, I would much rather run an adventure I came up with than run a published adventure. And the reason, it really doesn't have anything to do with how quote unquote well the adventure is written or put together. It's just because if I come up with my own adventure, I know that thing inside and out, and it's much easier for me to just answer the PC's questions, because I know when they ask me a question, I know instantly if it's something I've already figured out, and if it is something I've already figured out, I almost always remember what it is, or if it's something I haven't figured out and I need to come up with something on the fly. With a published adventure, unless you have a photographic memory, it's a lot harder to do that. And I find often I'm like, well, either A, I'm not sure if that question is answered, so let me look in the adventure and see if it's answered before I come up with my own answer. Or B, and this is much more common, I know that answer is in the adventure. I remember reading it. I don't remember exactly what it was, or I want to make sure I get it exactly right. So now I got to find it, and I don't remember exactly where it was. And now we have downtime, even if it's just a few seconds, we have downtime while I'm trying to find this thing in the adventure. And this never happens when I run my own stuff. Also, I find that adventures, and probably it's just necessary for them to be this way, but published adventures tend to be more linear and tend to be more railroady. And I've learned that even adventures that when you first look at them don't seem like they're railroady, a lot of times will be. You find out when you actually run them. And in case you don't know what I mean by railroady, which that's a terrible non-word, but basically what I mean by that is an adventure that is trying to force the PCs to go from A to B to C to D. And I would argue that just, if there's A, B, C, D, and they can do it in different orders, it's still kind of railroady in my mind. Because a lot of adventures will do that. They'll be like, well, the PCs have to do these things, but they can do them in any order. It's like, well, that statement right there, the PCs have to do these things, that's the railroad right there, right? Now, some adventures obviously do a better job of disguising that and making it so the characters or the players don't see the walls around them, even though they're there. We've talked a bit about sandbox versus plotted adventures on this show and in the Google Plus community. And, most of us, I think, agree that the sweet spot is somewhere in between, that a pure sandbox adventure is going to be directionless and boring for your players, and a pure plotted adventure is going to be railroady and have a lack of player agency. So all of us are most likely doing something somewhere in between, and the differences lie in where on that spectrum you're at personally. So how do I prepare for a session? And this is specific to Numenera, or this could work for The Strange too, because it's the same game system wise and prep wise. It's going to be very similar. So one thing that I do as I prepare for a session, and again, this is the same whether it's something I came up with or a published adventure, is I come up with ciphers ahead of time. Now, if it's a published adventure, it's really easy to do this because there's going to be certain locations on the map or certain encounters where it will say, the PCs find 1d6 ciphers and one artifact or whatever. And some of the adventures will actually tell you what those are. Like, for instance, the Devil's Spine, most of the ciphers that the PCs find in that adventure, the adventure actually tells you what the ciphers are, which is pretty cool because you don't have to come up with them yourself. Although a lot of times you still need to come up with a description for the cipher. A lot of times it won't necessarily give a description. It'll just give the mechanics. So I come up with my ciphers ahead of time, and there's a few reasons why I do this. First of all, and this is a thing of opinion. Different GMs have different styles. I'm not saying that the way I run games is the right way or the way everybody should do it. This is just my opinion, my style. Personally, I think it's bad form to generate ciphers during play, whether it's coming up with them off the top of my head or rolling on a table or just looking on a table for ones that look good. I feel like it's bad form to make my players sit there and wait, even if it's 5 seconds, even if it's 10 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes. I think it's bad form to make my players wait while I do that. It's like I should come to class prepared, right? And, back in the days when I played like D&D, I had some DMs that, if we killed a dragon, he already knew what was in the horde and he started handing stuff out. And it was especially cool with those DMs because a lot of times the magic items would be more than just some generic magic item from the book. It would be something unique that he'd come up with that was going to be really cool for your character or had some connection to the story. And then I had GMs that would literally have no clue what the treasure was. You killed a dragon, and now we sit for 5 or 10 minutes while he opens his Dungeon Master's Guide and rolls up the treasure. And the first couple times that happened, I actually thought it was kind of cool. I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's kind of part of the game that we're finding out piece by piece what this treasure is as the DM rolls it up. But after the first time or two that happened, I didn't think it was cool at all. It was like, A, it killed the pacing of the story, and B, I kind of found it insulting as a player. It's like, you're going to run a game for me and you didn't even take the time to come up with the treasure ahead of time. And now we all have to sit while you do this and invariably get out of character as we start talking about other things while we're waiting for you to do this. And it just kind of, to me, it seemed like a lack of respect on the DM's part for the players. So I carry that over to when I run games. I don't want to make my players sit through that. I would rather come up with ciphers ahead of time anyway because of a couple other reasons. And one is and I've talked about this on the show before, I want my ciphers to make sense. I don't want you to pull a cape or a 6-finger glove out of an accelerator, and I want them to make sense as far as the materials that they're made out of. I also like to think of descriptions, like what does this cipher look like ahead of time? Because again, if I just come up with this on the fly, they're going to be fairly generic descriptions and you're going to see the same thing repeated over time. And I would rather take some more time and come up with something more original. Now, here we get into the Cipher Conundrum I've talked about, which I've actually stopped doing this so much because so many ciphers are just either not used or not picked up or whatever. So I don't put as much time into the descriptions as I used to, but I at least come up with the basic form. Like, is it a handheld device? Is it a projector? Whatever. And then when I'm handing out the cipher, I can on the fly come up with a description based on that. But at least I know that, I'm not handing out tons of pill ciphers, or I'm not handing out tons of detonators that are ceramic spheres that you throw, that I have some variety. Unless, again, it makes sense because of the context of the cipher that you would find a bunch of things that are similar. So those are things I like to think about for verisimilitude and suspension of disbelief. So the ciphers make sense, and so that there's this level, this layer beneath the surface behind, like tying the ciphers together, tying them to the story, that even if the players never figure out or investigate, just the fact that it's there makes the world and the story feel more multidimensional to the players. Another reason I like to come up with ciphers ahead of time is sometimes I may want to seed a specific cipher or a specific effect into the game because maybe, for instance, here's an example from the Bio Borogal, one of the adventures in the core book. Darcy and I talked about this way back, like episode 13 or something. And we talked about how there's an encounter in this adventure with a very powerful NPC that unless the PCs have some way to communicate telepathically, there's really no way that this encounter can go down in a non-violent way. And so if I have something like that coming up in the game and I know it's coming, I like my PCs to have as many options as possible to solve a problem. I don't like to put them in a situation where the only way they can get out of it is to attack something or to do any one thing. So in that situation, I would say, well, I really want my PCs to at least have the possibility of having a telepathic ability. So at least the possibility of a social interaction is there. It's still up to them whether they want to take it. So in a situation like that, I might want to make sure that one of those ciphers is a telepathic cipher. Now, of course, the PCs may use it before that encounter happens, but at least I tried, right? So I come up with ciphers ahead of time, and that's why. And again, with a published adventure, this is super easy because it's going to tell you where you find ciphers and how many. And also, when I'm talking about ciphers, I'm also artifacts and oddities I'm coming up with too. I think that's pretty obvious. With an adventure myself, I just think of times when they might find ciphers, or what I've been doing for the Obsidian Monolith, and I will probably actually make this part of the supplement, is I just generated a ton of ciphers. I went through and I kind of, I came up with myself for the adventure. Like at this point, if they explore this thing, they'll find 1d6 ciphers or whatever. And I went through and I totaled up like the maximum number of ciphers they could find. And then I came up with that many and then some. And I did the same with artifacts and oddities. And I just I have a page of ciphers. And every time they find a cipher, I pick one off of there. And then I cross it off and I know, okay, I've given them that cipher. And it's also nice because then I have in my hands a list of all the ciphers that they have access to. So I kind of have some idea of what they're capable of. So that's the way I've started doing it, and it's working really well. And then that way I can also, if there's a particular cipher that I really like, I can make sure to not give that to them when they already have a million ciphers. Like wait until they've used a bunch of ciphers and they can hold some more, and then have them find that one cipher that I either really like or it's crucial to something coming up in the story. So I come up with ciphers. Another thing I do when preparing for a Numenera session is I come up with GM intrusions. Now, I don't always do this, but more often than not, I do it. And every time I don't do it, I always regret not doing it. And usually if I don't do it, it's just because I ran out of time. It's not because I'm like, I'm not going to do it. Like I always want to do it, just sometimes I run out of time. So what I try to do is I plan my sessions in scenes, and I'll talk about this in the example a little later. And what I do is for each scene, I try to have at least 2 GM intrusions for that scene. And then also over the course of the session, I try to have at least 2 GM intrusions for each character, okay, for each player character. So this is above and beyond any GM intrusions that are given in the published adventure I'm running, or any GM intrusions that are given in the creature entry of any creatures or NPCs from the bestiary or the core book that I'm using. It's above and beyond any published GM intrusions. I try to come up with at least 2 for every scene and at least 2 for each player overall. And the reasons I do this is I really like my intrusions to be creative and original. I don't like giving out like generic intrusions over and over again. And I have just learned, for me personally, I do a lot better if I have this list of intrusions for the session, and I have each character, and I have here's a couple intrusions for this character that I could use at some point. And those I try to use either their focus or their background or their descriptor, or if nothing else, their type, as kind of an inspiration for those character-based intrusions. So, if I have a character who bears a halo of flame, I might have an intrusion involving him accidentally setting something on fire or something like that. And then I also, like I said, for each scene, have a couple at least intrusions that really fit that scene, or maybe make sure that something I want to happen in the scene happens, or maybe connects the scene to the next scene or another scene or something like that. And then as I'm running the game, I'm always looking for intrusions, for opportunities for intrusions, for opportunities to use the intrusions I've come up with ahead of time, for opportunities to use intrusions in the bestiary entry I'm using if it's an encounter, or just opportunities for intrusions that I just see in play that is something completely on the fly that comes to me. I have found that for me personally, I feel like the recommendation of one intrusion per character per session and one intrusion, at least one intrusion per hour, is, for me, that is the minimum I want in my game for a few reasons. One, the simplest is just for XP flow. I found that the more XP that's given in game, the more likely players are to not hoard it and to use it for rerolls and stuff. And especially if you're using the alternate system I talked about last episode, where you're limiting GM intrusion XP for the rerolls and short-term skills and stuff like that, you want to make sure that you're giving plenty of that out. But also, I think that GM intrusions are part of what make this game unique and cool, and they really add a lot to the story. And I've never ended a session and thought, I did way too many GM intrusions in that session. But I have ended sessions and thought, I think that session would have benefited from a few more GM intrusions. I got kind of caught up in things and forgot to do some, or forgot to look for chances to do them. So if I can do more than one per character per session or one per hour, then that's awesome, as long as it's not getting ridiculous, right? And then the other thing I do when I prepare, and this is something that used to be about the only prep I did back when I ran Changeling and Vampire, I took some time off gaming. I played Vampire and Changeling, both second edition. I played D&D second edition. Then I played D&D 3.0. Then I played D&D 3.5. And somewhere towards the end of the run of D&D 3.5, I moved around the country a few times, and I just kind of got out of contact with the people I used to game with because I'd moved. This was before Google Plus was a thing. This was before we had video conferencing online. So, the only way to game online was like play by post or something crappy like that. So for a few years, I didn't game. And then when I started getting back into gaming, when I was living in Seattle, that was when 4th edition was happening. And at first I was pissed off that there was yet another edition of D&D. It's like, come on, seriously? But then I was like, well, I'll check it out. I still have all my 3.5 books. Or no, I take that back. At that point, I think I'd sold all my 3.5 books. So I watched some actual plays of 4th edition on YouTube. And I was like, this game sucks. No offense if you like 4th edition. But it definitely wasn't for me. So then that's when I found out about Pathfinder. And I got into Pathfinder for a while. So I'd not played for a few years. I started playing Pathfinder, and then I started running Pathfinder. And part of this I blame on just I didn't play for a while and I forgot kind of my old habits. And part of it I blame on Pathfinder and the way that game is. But I lost some of my good GMing habits, and this was one of them. And it's something that I've decided to reinstitute because, as you may or may not know, I have suggested or said that there might be an actual play of the Obsidian Monolith. I've not promised that there will be. I've been very careful every time I've mentioned it to say that there might be because I've never done an actual play before, and honestly, it just may not be possible. But I've been running a playtest of the Obsidian Monolith. I have been recording it. So far, it's pretty good. The first episode, the sound quality isn't that great, although it's still better than a lot of APs I've heard, but not up to my standards. But the later ones are much, much better. And I won't get into the technicalities of that, but I found a much better way to record it that has much better audio. I'm hoping to release that one day once we're done. and I can get it all edited. It's a nightmare to edit 4-hour sessions with 5 people, but I hope to do that. But one thing really cool I've learned about recording your sessions is, as I'm spending hours upon hours upon hours editing these things, I'm listening to myself run a game, and it's a great way to evaluate yourself as a GM and see what you're doing that's working and see what you're doing that's not working. And the thing that I notice myself doing, which is the number one criticism I ever have of other GMs, like when I'm listening to an AP or watching an AP, is I'm not describing things. Sometimes writers talk about the gray mist, which is where you're in a scene, in a story, and you're not given any description of where you're at. You just have these 2 characters having dialogue, and maybe you have a little bit of a description of the characters, but they're just in a gray mist. You don't know where they're at, or maybe they're in a room, but you don't know anything about that room. And so each reader is visualizing something totally different, or they're visualizing nothing. And one of the keys to good writing is to use short and concise but evocative descriptions. The point to role-playing is I notice that a lot of times I'm not giving descriptions, or I'm not giving very good descriptions. And I just watched on YouTube. I've been trying to wrap my head around the Fate system, and I watched a bit of an actual play of Fate on YouTube. And something I noticed that this GM did was, it was the first session of the campaign, and he started out with maybe, 2 or 3 minutes. He just set the scene. And it was obvious he was reading it. I mean, it was something he'd thought about and he'd written out, and it was very like good writing, like very evocative description using all 5 senses. You're in this place, you smell the rain in the air, and you hear the hum of the neon lights, and and not only did he establish this is where you are, this is what the world is like, this is what it looks like, but he set a very strong mood, and it was awesome. And the light bulb went on. I connected that with, my editing of the actual play. And I was like, oh my God, that's what I used to do in Vampire. That's what I used to do in Changeling. I don't do that anymore. I don't have descriptions written out. I don't even necessarily every time sit and visualize in my head what a particular scene looks like so I can describe it. Or if I do, I forget to describe it in the game because I'm all wrapped up in what's going on. So what I used to do when preparing for Changeling and Vampire is, for every scene, I had a paragraph that I actually wrote, printed out or hand wrote on paper, that I spent some time and thought on this description. Again, so now I can get into what makes good description. It has to be concise. Now, writing styles change over time, and you can go and read stuff written maybe in the 90s or the 80s when things were a little different, and you'll read pages and pages of description, and just try to read that, or go read classical literature. You'll see a lot of this. It's like your eyes start to glaze over. Depending on what kind of reader you are, you might start flipping pages looking for something actually happening. And it's just, our attention span and our brains can only handle so much information at a time. And our brains very naturally, when we're getting a lot of information, we prioritize it, right? We decide what's signal and what's noise. And our brains do this naturally. This is just how our perception works. And so you hit someone with a bunch of description, they're going to decide for themselves a few little nuggets out of that's important. And they're going to remember that, but they're going to disregard or quickly forget the rest of it. And they're going to be bored to tears, and you're going to waste a lot of time, and your voice is going to go dry like mine does in this podcast. So what you want to do with a good description is you want it to be concise, but you want it to be vivid and evocative. And Stephen King wrote an excellent book called On Writing. And if you want to check that out, it's great stuff for any kind of storyteller, including game masters. If you do check it out, I really recommend you listen to the audiobook because he reads it himself, and it's excellent. It's excellent. And not only is it his advice and thoughts on writing and being a writer, but it's just a lot of kind of things that have happened to him in his life and stories, and it's awesome stuff. But he talks about when he sets a scene that he picks maybe 2 or 3 distinguishing, unique things about that place, and he describes those in detail, and then that's it. So I think the example he gives is like, let's say you're going into a diner, and right away I'm picturing, I'm thinking of Merlot's from True Blood, right? Okay, but some place like that, right? So you say, okay, the PCs are going to be in a diner. What are 3 interesting things about this diner? Okay, for one, let's say there's like tons of taxidermy, right? Like there's dead animal heads just everywhere. Okay, let's say that all of the tables have lamps, and no 2 lamps are the same. They're all different. And let's say that the tables, instead of having chairs, they have like these rustic wooden benches. Okay, so there's 3 things that make this diner different from other diners you might go to. And instead of going on and on for pages about this diner and describing every little thing in agonizing detail, you just describe those 3 things. You say you walk into the diner, there's stuffed animals like taxidermy everywhere. Over every table there's a deer head or a bear head or a boar head or something. There's a huge standing on its upright or on its hind legs grizzly bear in the back of the diner that towers over everybody. There are lamps on every table that are lit and provide this dim illumination, but all of the lamps are different. They don't match one another. And the tables, instead of having chairs, they have these rustic wooden benches that look like you took a log and sliced it in half lengthwise, and that's your bench. So you do that, and right away the PCs, they get those few details because it's not too much for them to grab onto. And then they fill in all the rest with generic diner. I mean, obviously there's plates on the tables and people eating, and although you could probably describe the sound of, people like the tinkling of the silverware against the plates, because again, you want to involve multiple senses, not just vision. You could describe the smell of bacon cooking from the kitchen or something like that. But the point is you describe a few discrete things, and then the players or the reader fills in the rest with their experience. And yeah, if you quiz them, they might all be picturing a slightly different diner, but it will all have these fundamental things in common that you've described. And it, part of engaging a reader in a story is you don't want to describe too much, because you want them to fill in the gaps with their imagination, because now they're participating. Now it's an active thing, and they're more engaged. And the same thing in a role-playing game. So what I do when I'm preparing a game, what I do now, what I used to do and what I'm doing again, is for each scene, I write out ahead of time a vivid description, because good writing, you just don't do off the cuff. That's why writers don't publish their first draft, right? There are many drafts. And so, even if you're Stephen King, your first draft is not going to be, what you want to present to your players. You come up with a vivid description, you write it out and write it out so it's evocative and it's concise. Don't make it too long. Involve as many of the senses as you can. Ideally, you will involve sound and sight and smell at the very least with everything, because anything we experience, we get those 3 things. Taste and touch. You might not always be able to throw those in, but do every time that you can. But sound and sight and smell, those are really important. And smell is the one people will forget if they forget one. And smell is such a powerful sense. I could do a whole episode on smell and how it works in the brain and why it's so powerful and evocative, and why you don't want to forget it as a writer. I mean, think about times when you've... Oh, wait, no, that's sound. I was going to say, think about when you hear a song and it brings back a memory, but that's sound. But maybe your mom used to always make you banana pancakes, and you smell banana pancakes and you remember like sitting in the kitchen with your mom when you were a little kid, or chocolate chip cookies or something like that. I mean, we all have memories like that, right? So you know what I'm talking about. And like I said, listening to myself GM, which is about the most objective way you can evaluate yourself, other than getting other people to evaluate you. I found that when I wasn't doing this, my descriptions were very lacking or even non-existent. And nothing I would argue, makes for boring roleplay and very two-dimensional role-playing sessions than not having descriptions, not setting the scene in time and space for your players. And those are the games that turn into just rolling dice and moving miniatures when there's no description. So description is super important. So those are probably the big things that I do ahead of time for any session I run. Come up with ciphers, artifacts, and oddities ahead of time, come up with GM intrusions ahead of time, and come up with descriptions ahead of time. Another thing I like to ask myself often, especially if this is an adventure where the PCs are trying to accomplish something, is what happens if the PCs fail? And Jim kind of touched on this in the other episode when he was talking about how when he sets up a situation, he doesn't try to figure out how they're going to solve it, and he even tries to figure out or set up situations where he can't even think of how they'll solve it. So that's awesome, and I'm very inspired by that. But a part of that, obviously, is you need to think about what happens if they fail, because success isn't guaranteed. If it was, we wouldn't roll dice, right? I mean, failure, the possibility of failure is what makes it a game and not just mental masturbation. And I would argue that sometimes the PC should fail. I don't think the PC should succeed at everything they try to do. In writing, we talk about try-fail cycles. And you see this, look at any book or any movie that's decent, and you will see this. Luke Skywalker doesn't become a powerful Jedi like right away, right? How many times does he try to move something with his mind before he's able to do it whenever he wants? He tries and fails many, many times. Like, remember when he tries to lift the X-Wing and he can't do it? But then when he tries to grab his lightsaber when the snow beast is going to come kill him, he can do it. So letting the PCs fail then make their successes and their triumphs even more satisfying. So that's something to think about. What will you do if the PCs fail? Where will the story go? What will the consequences be if they fail? Because they may, and sometimes they should. And sometimes them failing makes for a much better story than if they would have succeeded. I mean, look at Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is very popular right now, the TV show and the books that it's based on. And you have characters failing all over the place there. And that's part of what makes that show what it is characters fail far often more than they succeed. And that's part of the magic of that show. And that's why we love it, because failing is real, right? These hero Superman stories where people are just awesome at everything. I mean, that's not real. That's fantasy. And most of us look for a certain amount of realism, at least in our fiction, so that we can connect with it. And so it's more rewarding when good things happen. I also like to try to come up with at least one or two hooks to throw into each session, or story seeds, however you want to look at it. And the goal for me here is, for one thing, to give the PCs multiple things to do, so it isn't a railroad. So it's not like, oh, we have to do this one thing GM wants us to do, or there's nothing to do. I like to give them options and say, well, here's something you could look into, or here's something you could look into, or here's something you can look into. And then they choose what they want to do. I try to give them more possibilities than they can actually do. And this is another of my old habits that I've realized I don't do anymore, that I'm trying to reinstate. And I used to do this in my Changeling games, and it was awesome. Every session I would throw in plot seeds and hooks, and they had multiples more than they could ever do. And it's really awesome because, for one thing, that minimizes this is what the GM wants us to do metagame thinking, which I hate. I hate it when I hear a player say, oh, well, I'm going to do this because this is obviously what the GM wants us to do. Now, I would say that that's a quote unquote good player, and I'll talk about that later. But I hate to hear it, because you're not in the game when you're saying that. You're not in the world. You're not engaged when you're saying that. You're outside of it looking in. And I don't like that. I want my players in it. This also makes the world feel more multidimensional and real, because in reality, we have a word, time management, right? We have that word because we know that there's not enough time to do everything you want to do or everything you have to do. So you have to prioritize and decide, what am I going to spend my time on? And so having that in your game, having more things for the characters to do than they can actually do, makes it seem more real. I also want to point out that even in a campaign, I usually only plan one session at a time, ahead of time, because I don't know what the PCs will do. Now, obviously, the Obsidian Monolith is different, but let me pull back the curtain a little bit. It's actually not different. It sounds to you like it's different because I'm on this podcast talking about this campaign, but as I'm running my playtest, I'm only planning the next session. I have these overarching plans and ideas, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next episode. But as far as the game session, what I'm planning the next session, and that's it. Now, obviously, with my second playtest, it's going to be different because I will have run a first playtest through it, hopefully completely or at least halfway. And then the second one, I'll have made changes and revisions based on what happened with the first one. So that one will be more like running a published adventure that I wrote myself, which will be kind of weird. Also, something to keep in mind that is awesome with the Cipher system is that if you do need to kind of nudge the PCs in a certain direction, or you need something specific to happen, if it doesn't happen organically, you can always use a GM intrusion to accomplish this, which is awesome. It's so great that there's a mechanic for that in this game. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about a little bit, and I've already kind of mentioned this, I think, is my GMing is influenced very highly by the old World of Darkness games by White Wolf, specifically Vampire the Masquerade 2nd Edition and Changeling the Dreaming 1st and 2nd Edition. So if you want to learn more about being a good game master, or in that game, they called it a storyteller, which I actually much prefer to the term game master. So you may hear me, I tried to say game master on here because this is a Numenera and the Strange podcast, but you may hear me say storyteller because I actually much prefer that term because I think that's more what we're doing in a game like this. Pathfinder, yeah, you're a game master, you're a referee, but in Numenera, you're a storyteller. You're all storytellers, right? You're just the head storyteller, I guess. Storyteller prime. But your players are storytellers too. So my GMing is influenced very highly by these old White Wolf games. And the way those games were presented, or adventures were presented, was they were presented in scenes. So that's how I think about it. Oh, and I got on a tangent. What I was going to say is if you want some good GM advice, go grab, if you can find it, the 2nd edition Vampire or Changeling book, or any of the 2nd edition White Wolf books, because I think the storytelling chapters were the same pretty much for all of them. They give really great advice and thoughts on setting up games and things. And I still have my Changeling book. Maybe I'll get that out and talk about some of that stuff sometime for those of you, because it's probably hard to find them now because they're out of print. So anyway, I think of a session in scenes. I usually prepare around 3 to 4 scenes for each session. And this varies even beyond that because certain scenes will take longer than others. And I usually end up over preparing. Usually the PCs don't get through as many scenes as I think they will, but sometimes the opposite happens and I end up having to come up with stuff on the fly because they tore through stuff faster. But the point here is, and this is another, I think, misconception people may get, is the point here is not to never improv. The point is to set yourself up with this firm foundation to run your game from so you can improv at the times when you really need to improv, when the players throw you a curveball or they do something you don't expect or they go someplace you didn't plan for or they talk to someone you don't plan for. Like, you're ready. You know, when that happens, you're at 100%, your batteries are fully charged, and bam, you hit them with the best you got. But at least for me, if I'm improving the whole session, like, I'm getting worn out. So I want to say I do not railroad the players, but it turns out that I almost always use the scenes that I come up with ahead of time. And this is where I will say, and this is really simplifying things, and I realize that. So you don't have to email me and tell me that I'm oversimplifying. I know I'm oversimplifying, but I'm making a point here. I think there are 2 types of players. There are players who will gamely follow a story that I present, what I like to call good players, because those players understand that this is a game. They understand that I have a story in mind that I'm trying to tell, and they want to experience the story. They trust me as a GM, and they think that I'm decent at what I do, and they want to experience the story that I've prepared for them, and they appreciate the time I've put into it. and they just want to experience a good story, and they know that it will be better if they kind of play along than if they go off the rails and make me come up with everything off the fly and just react to the crazy shit they do. There are also players who will intentionally go against a story. These are what I call bad players. There are players that will, as soon as they get the feel for what you want them to do, and I shouldn't say what you want them to do, but what, and again, the example I'm going to give, I think will make this make more sense. But, you've prepared an adventure. You have an idea of you're going to present a situation that you want them to deal with, and that's the adventure, right? And that's why I said you present a situation. Well, they could just choose not to deal with it, right? The whole town's on fire and everybody's dying, and they're just like, I leave town. That's what a bad player would do. And it's not so much what the player does that makes them a bad player. Oh, I'm going to hear about this. It's not so much what they do. It's why they're doing it. It's the player who says, I get it, GM. You want us to save this town. Fuck you. I'm going to do something different because I'm awesome and I'm more important than everybody else at this table. Or at least more important than the GM if the whole party is going along with that. So yeah, there are players who will intentionally go against a story as soon as they realize what the story is. Luckily, all the players in all of my groups that I run are what I like to call good players. Actually, luck has nothing to do with it because I won't play with those other types of players. So anyway, LexStarwalker@gmail.com if you would like to give me what for about what I just said. All right. So for each scene, so there's 3 or 4 scenes for the adventure, I come up with an evocative description, like I said, using as many of the 5 senses as I can. I have notes here, and it looks like if I say this, I will be repeating myself. Yeah. So I use evocative energy, evocative imagery, use as many senses as I can, at least the sight, sense, and smell. Sight, sense, and smell. Sight, hearing, and smell. Ooh, it's getting hot in here. And give the setting, 2 or 3 or 4 distinctive, unusual. I think in Numenera, a lot of times it will be unusual characteristics that make it stand out. And for each scene, like I said, I come up with some GM intrusions. And so I, of course, can't anticipate everything the players do. So I will have to make things up on the fly. I may have to make up scenes on the fly. But the scenes I've prepared anchor the session and make sure that at least for those scenes, I'll have good descriptions, I'll have multi-dimensional NPCs and creative GM intrusions. And so that will make up for the stuff I come up with on the fly being not quite so great. So again, I think the best way to illustrate all this is with an example. So I'm going to give you an example now. Before the example, I had to take a drink. My voice is going. I just got to tell you, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before. I'm kind of a little bit of an audiophile, and no, that doesn't mean that I have sex with CDs or something like that. No. Audiophile means that you're just obsessed with good audio, and I get a lot of compliments about the quality of the show, and that makes me happy, so I don't think it's wasted time. But one of the things I do to give you the best sound that I can is I shut off everything when I'm recording except for my computer. So all the fans are off, the air conditioning is off. And so the longer the show goes, the longer or the hotter it gets in here because I'm stupid and I record in, the hottest part of the day a lot of times in the early evening. And so it's pushing mid 90s outside today right now. It's probably about 100 with the heat index. And so when I started recording, it was a nice 70 degrees in here, but it's probably up in the 80s now. And it will be in the 90s by the time I'm done. So the sweat's starting to come out and my brain's starting to go crazy. So if I sound less lucid, it's not because I'm drinking. I'm actually not drinking alcohol. I'm drinking juice. It's because I'm overheating. So yeah, let's try to get through this before I pass out. All right. So an example will make this more clear, I think. Let's do something really basic and very linear to kind of show how this works. But obviously it doesn't have to be linear. But let's say I want to tell a story of a basic murder mystery story, right? So I want the PCs to solve a murder mystery because I think that would be fun. And actually I need to make a mystery. I don't think I've ever done a mystery. What's wrong with me? Okay, so this is how I might prepare for this story. And this would be like a 1 session thing, right? This is part of a bigger campaign, but I'm preparing for this one session in the campaign. So first, just my basic prep. I know that this adventure takes place in a small town. So let's say this is the first adventure for my campaign. Let's say this is the first adventure for the Obsidian Monolith. It's not. This isn't the first adventure for the Obsidian Monolith, but for sake of discussion, let's say it is. And so I'm starting out in a small town. It's a town I'm making up. It's not a Fasten that we already have info on. It's a town I'm making up. I'm going to come up with things about this town first, not only for this adventure, but for at least the beginning of the campaign. Maybe the whole campaign will take place around this town. So I come up with what and who is in the town, come up with like your main places, how many taverns are there? How many inns are there? How big is the town? How many people live there? Is there a stable? Is there, blah, 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 blah. Come up with the basic things. And here I'm focusing on places and PCs. I think that, or places and NPCs that I think the PCs will likely interact with. Obviously, they're going to go to an inn. They're going to stay there, assuming if they don't live in town already. There are certain NPCs they may interact with, like the mayor or the sheriff, if there is such a thing. So I start coming up with those things. So each place I come up with at this time, I come up with a description too. So let's say there's a general store in my town. So the first time the PCs walk into a general store, boom, here's the description. Here's what they see. I set the general store, set the stage, and then, in the future, if I did a good job with that description, I don't need to describe it again because they'll remember. But if I need to, it's there. I also, with these places, come up with the NPCs that might be there. So, the guy running the general store, or in a tavern, the person running the tavern. And depending on how important I think this NPC will be, if it's going to be just a minor person, that like a merchant they're going to buy stuff from, I might just have a name and a very basic description of what they look like, and maybe a very basic 1 or 2 or 3 words about their personality, and that's it. And then, like Jim Walls, I take a lot of notes as I'm GMing, and I recommend you do this too. Anything that you come up with on the fly while you're running a game, write it down, So, they go to the general store and buy stuff, and now I've got this character that I've got like 5 words about, but now I have to role play this character. And as I role play it, I develop their personality more. Maybe they have some idiosyncrasies about the way they talk or something like that. Or maybe the PCs want more of a description, and so I come up with more than the few words I wrote about what they look like, things like that. So I will write that down so that later I can go back to that NPC and add in the stuff that I've done to flesh them out, so that I can remember in the future what all I've done with that NPC. I also write down things like if the PC's pissed him off and he doesn't like them anymore, or the NPC thinks one of the PCs is attractive, or stuff like that. So again, I'm not exhaustively coming up with everything in this town, just the places of import, places that I know either will be important to the story I'm telling, or places that I just think it's likely the NPCs or the PCs will go to. So for instance, they're likely to go somewhere to try to buy, trail rations and adventuring gear and stuff like that. They're likely to at some point maybe go somewhere to try to procure a mount. There may be likely at some point to, if there's an Eon Priest, to go to the Eon Priest to find out about a Numenera item or get some information. So those kinds of things. Obviously, I won't come up with everything. The PCs may be like, is there a dentist in town? That I never thought about if there's a dentist in town. And maybe I'm like, yeah, there's a dentist. And now I got to, come up with this on the fly because they're going to go see the dentist, right? So again, this is not eliminating improv. It's just saving it for when you need it. If that happens and they want to go see the dentist, I don't think there'd be a dentist, but maybe. That was more of like 1800s, right? There weren't dentists in the Middle Ages, I don't think. But anyway, you can write me, lexstarwalker@gmail.com, and educate me on history. Again, I have my list of NPC names that I think I've talked about before. I have a list of names, so when the players are like, what's the name of the dentist? I can be like, well, let me look at my list of names and pick one that sounds like a good dentist name, because I suck at coming up with names. I suck at it. Like, that's the hardest part of making a character for me, is the name. So I just get names from weird places, and every time I hear a name that sounds weird, I write it down, and I have this huge list of names. So that's my basic prep, right? So for this, I'm starting a campaign, so I'm preparing this town. And I think I make this point a few times, but I want to make it right here. There's no such thing. Maybe in a one-shot it's different, but when you're running a campaign, there is no such thing as wasted prep. You know, I've heard some people put forward this idea of, I don't do any prep because I don't know what the PCs are going to do, and I don't want to prepare something and then they don't go there and it's wasted. There's no such thing as wasted prep. Even if you're running a one-shot, there's no such thing as wasted prep. If you come up with an NPC and they never go there and never talk to that NPC, you can use that NPC, put them somewhere else that they do go, or use them in your next adventure or in your next campaign. If you come up with a cool spot in the town that they never go to, you could A, come up with a good reason for them to go there, or B, use that for some other location in the future that they do go to. For instance, if you have to come up with something on the fly, grab one of these things that you never use that you think are wasted and use that, and it's suddenly not wasted. And again, because I'm setting up a campaign, none of this is wasted also because they're going to be in this town for a while, and even if they don't go to the stables in this game session, they may go in the next game session. The other thing about this, the way I prepare is, especially for campaigns, it's very front loaded. I do a lot of prep in the beginning of the campaign, and then as the campaign goes, I do less and less and less. Because once I have all these NPCs in the town figured out, I don't have to do that anymore. And after the first few adventures of a campaign, there's little to no prep. In fact, I would say at that point, I might even have less prep than a full sandbox GM might have. Well, maybe not. I don't know. But my point is it's very front loaded, and the longer the campaign goes, the less prep I have to do because I do so much in the beginning. All right, so I've done my basic prep. So the next thing, and this is the easiest, is the opening scene, or scene 1. And this is the one scene that you actually have control of because this is the first session of a campaign and you're the GM, so you get to tell the PCs where they start out. So this is one scene that you know for sure will happen exactly the way you envision it. So here's scene 1 for our murder mystery. The PCs are in a tavern. So I will open the session with a description of this tavern. Very evocative description. I'm going to use at least 3 senses. I think since we're in a tavern, I can even use taste. I can describe the food that they're eating or the ale that they're drinking. And since they're sitting in a tavern, I could even use touch and describe maybe the chairs are especially comfortable or uncomfortable. I'm also going to describe the NPCs in the tavern, and I may not flesh out all of the NPCs ahead of time. Again, you leave some room for improv, but I will at the very least flesh out NPCs that I think it's likely the PCs will interact with. For instance, the bartender, the person waiting on their table. If there's a minstrel entertaining the bar, that's someone that the PCs may very well interact with. So those NPCs, I will at least have a name, a description of what they look like, and an idea of what their personality is. And real quick, something I do with NPCs that is a little trick, and I think a lot of GMs do this, so this may not be a newsflash to anyone, but in case you're a new GM, this is for new GMs. Here's a little trick with NPCs. Okay, so let's say the bartender. Okay, I've got this bartender. I think of a character. Now, you could use a character from a book, but I use characters from movies and TV shows because that's a character I can see, right? I can see them. I know how they talk. I know what their voice sounds like. And I will pick a character for that character. So let's say we got our bartender. I'm like, who would be a good bartender for my bar? And I think, and I'm like, well, maybe this is kind of a swanky bar. I don't know if that's the word, but maybe this bar actually is a combination of a bar and a brothel, let's say. So I am going to base my bartender off of the character Kendra from Defiance, who is a woman in the show who basically runs a brothel, and she's a character I really like. And what this does is on my little notes for the NPCs. Now, obviously, I can't do this with my published adventure, but on my personal stuff for the NPCs, I just write Kendra from Defiance, and then I write this character's name, and then I don't even have to write the description. Although, again, I'm trying to do nice evocative description, so I will probably write it ahead of time just so I can do a better description. But if it happens, and this is great for NPCs on the fly, let's say for some reason I don't anticipate Or no. Let's say there's a brothel in town, and I don't anticipate that the PCs are going to go to the brothel on the first adventure. Although if there's a brothel, I probably should anticipate that they'd go there. But let's say I don't anticipate that. And so they're like, we want to go check out the brothel. And so I, describe the brothel on the fly. Again, I might grab something since I have to do this on the fly. I saw a couple brothels in the show Deadwood. I'll describe one of those. That would fit in the setting pretty well, I think, especially in this particular kind of frontier type town. So I use that to kind of go for my description. But you don't tell them, hey, you remember that brothel in Deadwood? No. You don't say that. Bad GM, bad. It kicks them out of the story. And I've done that before and I always regretted it. Bad idea. Describe it. Just you picture that brothel and you describe it to them. You don't tell them that it's a brothel from Deadwood because it's got nothing to do with the Ninth World. And besides, it they don't want to know how the sausage is made. It's a lot more enjoyable if they don't. So then I'm like, well, they want to talk to the person running the establishment. And I'm like, oh crap, I need an NPC. Who would be a good NPC to run a brothel? Oh, Kendra from Defiance. And boom, I can describe her. I know what she looks like. I know how she talks. I've got some ideas of her personality. And, to the PCs, unless they're huge Defiance fans and they, from my description, can recognize her, which is highly unlikely, they just think I'm a genius, right? So there's a little trick. But I do that in prep anyway, because I found that not just on the fly, but when I'm preparing, I've found that it makes my NPCs more three-dimensional if I base them off of a character. And I don't make them exactly that character. I make changes. And those are the things I'll note. Like for this character, I might say, Kendra from Defiance, only, I don't know, she's married to someone else in the town. I don't know. I would make some changes and I would note those changes. I would say, play this character as the character Kendra from Defiance, except for these changes, that kind of thing. Okay, so, wow, today's the day of tangents. Isn't every day the day of tangents? I am Tangent Man. Fear my tangents, evildoers. Okay, I come up with NPCs, and then, so that's my prep for that scene, right? I've got my description, I've got my NPCs, and then I start the game. When I run the game, I give the description, I read it, and I like to practice them so it's at least partly memorized. So it's not like you walk into a bar and you see a woman there who looks kind of like, so it's not like I'm reading something. But I would argue it's better to read a good description than to extemporaneously give a weak description. Anyway, so I give the description, and then at this point I would let the PCs roleplay. I'd say, okay, you're sitting at a table. You just finished this great meal of whatever. I wouldn't say whatever. I'd come up with something. And, you're listening to this minstrel play and she's playing some sad song about lost love. And these are the people around you. Describe everything really well. And then, this is where you're at. This is what's going on. What do you do? And then at this point, if the PCs want to, they can role play. They can role play with each other. They can role play with the NPCs. As soon as things kind of wind down, or this could be immediately, if they don't seem like they really want to role play, then boom, something happens. Don't let things drag, right? As soon as it starts to wind down, boom, something happens. Even better, if you can anticipate when you think things are going to wind down, have something happen a little bit before that. Like that's the masterful way to do it, right? So something happens. What happens? The PCs hear a scream from outside the bar. So at this point, what do? You hear a scream, a woman scream, this blood-curdling scream that suddenly cuts off right outside the bar. What do you do? And at this point, I'm not planning what they do, but there's obvious choices. They could either ignore the scream and keep doing what they're doing, or they could go out to investigate, right? I mean, that's kind of... and anything they do will be some version of one of those, right? Like, it's not too hard to figure this stuff out. So if the PCs go out to investigate, well, that starts my murder mystery story, right? That I want to run. If they don't immediately say, oh, we go investigate what's going on. If they're just like, oh, that's cool, I keep eating my soup or whatever. Then after a few minutes, an NPC runs in from outside and says, oh my God, so-and-so's been murdered. And then runs back outside, like obviously upset. So at this point, if the PCs still don't go out to investigate, then I'm like, cool, I'm not going to tell them what to do. I'm not going to set the inn on fire so they have to go outside. I just think to myself in the back of my mind, okay, so this scene is playing out with the NPCs. The PCs aren't involved. People are coming. They're finding the body. The constable comes and examines it, and, investigation starting, whatever. And I might end up skipping scene 2, which is coming up next, because if the PCs don't go to investigate, scene 2 either won't happen or will happen differently. And at this point, I improvise and have maybe a constable or or the mayor of the town or some other NPC come in and ask the PCs to help, because, they feel like the PCs can help with this. So again, my players in any of my games I run would have been investigating by this point, if not before, because they're good players and we all metagame a little bit. I think it's unavoidable. And I think a good player, when something like this happens, is like, obviously something cool is happening. I should go investigate, because if I don't, I'll miss this something cool that the GM planned, right? I mean, that's why we play the game, to experience cool stories. Okay, so they decide to go investigate, let's say. So now scene 2 is body in the street. So this scene occurs outside the tavern where a newly slain person lays in the street. When I wrote this up, I hadn't even thought about if it was a man or woman, but I just said to you that it was a woman. Again, on the fly, I decided it was a woman, so now it's a woman. Again, I come up with a description of the scene. So you walk out, boom, this is what you see. This is what you experience. Set the scene. In this case, it would be mainly a description of a corpse in the road. And I would have more description about the corpse that I would give, assuming at that point when the PCs investigate it. Because, obviously, if they're going to investigate, the first thing they're going to look at is the corpse. So I have that ready. Like, are there indications of how this woman was killed? Things like that. I also would come up with any NPCs that are going to be on the scene. Since this is going to be a murder mystery, in addition to just the basic, things I would do with an NPC, their description and personality and what they look like, I also need to know what each NPC saw, what they remember, which of course isn't the same as what they saw, and what they will willingly share with the PCs, and what they may share with the PCs if the PCs make some kind of successful social role, like intimidation or persuasion or whatever. So because this is a murder mystery, I need to know those things, because presumably the first thing the PCs will do after examining the body is questioning witnesses, right? We've all seen cop shows. We know how it's done. So at this point, the adventure opens up and becomes more sandboxy because just of the nature of it. Now, I can anticipate where the PCs will go and who they'll talk to based on the information I give them through the NPCs, right? I mean, this is why I chose this for an example, because we're also familiar with murder mysteries and they're so formulaic. It's also because the formula is real. Like, it's how it's really done, right? Like, if you're investigating, first thing you do is look at the body. Next thing you do is question witnesses, or maybe you question witnesses first because they might sneak off and the body isn't going anywhere, right? But you do those two things, and then you follow the leads that you get from the witnesses or from the body, right? Now, I don't know what order they will follow leads. I can probably guess based on which leads seem stronger than others. I think most people would follow the strongest lead first and work their way down from there. But I don't need to know. I know I've given them these leads, and to follow up on these leads will involve going to these places and or talking to these NPCs. So again, those are places and NPCs I will have prepared ahead of time. Now, each of these locations and or NPCs will become another scene that I prepare for, just like I did for these scenes above. I'm not going to keep going beyond here. Like, you see how it is. So perhaps, one of the witnesses says, oh, I just saw her arguing with the baker's wife. Okay, so I have a scene with the baker's wife, and we find the baker's wife at the bakery. And so I have a description of the bakery and the baker's wife. Or now maybe the PCs will throw a wrench and say, well, we're not going to go talk to her at the bakery. We're going to wait till she goes home at night. Now, she probably lives above the bakery or in the same building as the bakery. But if she doesn't, now I got to come up with her home on the fly. But again, unless you railroad your PCs, you're never going to avoid coming up with things on the fly. That's not the point. It's just to choose your battles, save your energy kind of thing. So again, from here on out, it opens up. They can do things in any order. I'll have a scene with whoever did it. assuming that they find out who did it. But from here, it's me, like I set the stage and now I'm reacting to what they do. So I don't know. I guess people might decide sandboxes in different ways. I think the only thing that keeps this from being a true sandbox is that there's just this kind of one thing going on. But honestly, if I was running a campaign, the first adventure, it might just be this one thing going on. But again, one of the things that I'm doing when I'm preparing for sessions is I'm coming up with subplots or story seeds or plot hooks to throw at the players. So there's not just one thing going on. So maybe while they're investigating this murder, they meet some other PCs that need their help, and they need to decide, do we pause the murder investigation and help this NPC with this? Or do we maybe come back later to help the NPC? Or do we just not help the NPC? Things like that. I think that illustrates basically what I do. Again, this may seem like a lot of prep to you, but it really doesn't take much time. Honestly, it probably took me more time to explain it to you than it would take to do. Also, again, I run campaigns. I don't run one-shots usually. So there's no such thing as wasted prep. All the thing I come up with for this town, I'll use eventually because the PCs will be here for a while. And even if I don't use something, I can put it in the next town that they come to. All the NPCs I come up with, I'll use for the same reason. And again, if I don't, they can be an NPC in some other place that the PCs go to. So there's no such thing as wasted prep. It all can be used in one way or another. Another thing I want to point out is that I also always have a living world. I think that's the term I should use, in which every campaign I run takes place in the same world. I ran D&D for well over a decade, started out 2nd edition, went into 3.0 and 3.5, and during that entire time period, I was running in my version of the Forgotten Realms, and everything that happened in every campaign I ran in that setting over that 10 plus years was part of the setting. And so when campaign 2 started, the things that happened in campaign 1, they still happened and they're part of the history. And when campaign 3 starts, the things that happened in campaign 1 and 2 happen. And so I had some players that played with me through the whole time. Most of the players, I had players come and go, but I had 1 or 2 that were playing the whole time, and they got to see my setting grow and change over a decade because of things that the players had done. And the same thing with my Ninth World. Every Ninth World game I run, or every Numenera game I run, takes place in the same Ninth World, the same continuity. It's not like every time I run Numenera, it's this generic Ninth World where everything's like it was in the book. When I make changes to the world, they're forever. When the PCs make changes to the world, they're forever. So if I have the same player play in campaign 1 and they kill the Queen of Charmand in campaign 2, the Queen of Charmand is dead and it's someone else running Charmand. When you run a game like that, which I really recommend, it's really awesome, especially for your players that stay with you. If you run multiple campaigns, there's really no wasted effort in that, because all the stuff I create, if I just create this town and just go nuts on this town, and then the PCs do take a left turn in the first session and leave town and never go back, it's still not wasted. I could take that stuff from that town and put it somewhere else, or I could leave it in that town and in my next campaign start in that town again. Maybe all my campaigns start in that town. Over time, all of it will be used. If you run your game like this, there's no such thing as wasted prep. Now, if you're running a bunch of one-shots, it's a little bit different, but there's still no reason that all your one-shots can't take place in the same world and have a continuity unless you're just running the same adventure over and over. It was funny. Before I went to Gen Con, I said, I've never run an adventure more than once. And now I have. I ran the Violet Veil 4 times. And after running an adventure more than once, I don't recommend it. I'm not a fan of it. Yeah, the second time was kind of cool because I got to say, okay, these things I did the first time, I'd like to do a little bit differently and try to improve upon it. But every time I ran it, it was less fun. But again, I don't run published adventures either. I've run more published adventures since getting Numenera than I have in my life up to that point. And at this point, I'm pretty much done. I'm still working my way through Devil's Spine, and I'm running Beyond All Worlds. And, I do some stuff for the asset team that's by nature published adventures, but I'm pretty much done. I much prefer running my own stuff. And I think even for Gen Con next year, I might run my own adventure. I might come up with my own one shot instead of running a published one, because I just have a lot more fun with it. And then that way I can have different adventures. Like if I run Numenera 4 times at Gen Con, they can all be different. So I don't have to run the same thing over and over. So anyway, if that's you, if you're running the same one shot over and over, then there's not wasted prep either, right? Because you're running the same adventure over and over. And even if they don't talk to this certain NPC the first time you run it, they might the third time you run it, right? So yeah, there's my thoughts on that. There's some thoughts on how I run a game. Again, especially after talking to Jim Walls, I felt like at least some people were getting this impression that isn't really accurate of how I run games. So I wanted to talk about it. And I also wanted to try to help out like all the people that are asking, well, how do you actually run a session? Because I see that question, honestly, even more than I see the how do you string adventures together. And I realize that this podcast is a great way to do that. So I apologize if you're all super psyched about learning more about the campaign, that I basically spent a whole episode talking about this. I was actually going to go into some stuff with the first adventure, like I told you I would in the last episode, but wow, I am running really long. So I wonder if I should. What do you think? Should I talk a little bit about the first adventure like I planned on, or wait till next week? What do you think, Nikki? Nikki says I should wait, but I feel like you listener listening right now, you're like, no, I want to hear about the first adventure. So I tell you what, I'll tell you a little bit about the first adventure. I'm going to tell you what I plan to tell you. I was planning to stretch this over 2 episodes anyway, because, full disclosure, my playtest has gotten a little behind. We had to miss a session because I was busy. I'm super busy right now with all these games I run. And one of my players had a wedding that they wanted to go to, and we're really getting into it, and I didn't want people to miss. So I'm a little bit behind on the playtest, and I'm trying to avoid spoiling things too much for my players in the playtest. Second playtest, I don't know what we're going to do. They're just going to be spoiled, I guess. Spoiled rotten. So there are things that I don't want to get into right now about the first adventure, mainly things involving like the overall arc of the campaign. So I will just tell you that I have more planned for the entire campaign that I'm not sharing right now, just because I don't want it to be spoilers for my players, and it's not super relevant, but I will talk a bit about how I planned the first adventure. It's my first day, first day podcasting. Mistakes were made. So as I said in the last episode of the Obsidian Monolith, I've decided to start near the Westwood in Navarine. I've decided that I want to do something with the Kalovas and their conflict with the Navarine loggers. My question is, how will the PCs treat these creatures? Assuming they get involved with the conflict, which they may not, that's definitely a possibility. But if they do, which side will they choose, or will they not choose sides? Will they see these Kalovas as natives of this area that have first dibs and are being treated horrifically and unfairly by the humans, or will they see them as beasts that should be slain? Yeah, I'm really interested. So that's one of the themes I'm looking at for the beginning of the campaign in the Westwood area. I also like the idea of starting in a small town. John Wright was talking about this when he was on the show, when we were talking about his buddy Johnny running his first Numenera game, which, by the way, Johnny's going to be on the show, if not next week, the week after that. I'm super excited to talk to him. He was talking about how one thing that Johnny did that he thought was a great idea for a new GM was he kept the scope small for the first adventure. It was in this small area, and let him kind of keep things contained a little bit and kind of limited the things that could happen to make it easier on him. And so I wanted to do that because I thought that was brilliant, and hopefully I'll have some brand new GMs running this adventure. So I want to ease them into it, right? So I like the idea of starting in a small town and keeping the small scale at the beginning. It also makes the story more personal, and like I say, it gives the GM to get a feel before the world opens up. And it also gives the players a real connection to a real place of origin in the Ninth World, so they can deepen their background and their immersion in the world, which is awesome. And like Jim said, I too love PCs with developed backgrounds that I can pull from later. So I decided that one of these small logging towns that exist on the edge of the Westwood would be perfect for my purposes. It would be a good home base for the PCs. It will have them in Navarine so that they're in the area of the monoliths when it comes time for that. And it will make it very easy to bring in the Kalovas and work with that. So the first thing I thought about when coming up with the first adventure is I thought about what are my goals? Like, what do I want to accomplish with this first adventure? You have to know what your goals are if you have any prayer of achieving them, unless just by accident, right? So that's about the first thing I do with anything is what are my goals, right? So, and I also want to keep in mind that the players may also be new to the game, right? So here are my goals with this first adventure. First of all, I want to introduce the setting of the ninth world. I want to introduce the setting to the players. I want to show them the weird in the setting. I want to show them this dichotomy in the tech levels, how, most of the things you see around you is this kind of medieval level technology and social development, but yet underlying it is the Numenera, this hyper advanced technology that people are using without really understanding. And I want to really get across the weird juxtaposition of that really primitive technology juxtaposed with really advanced technology that's kind of at the heart of the weird of the setting. I really want to get that across. Also, I want to start with action. I want to get the game going right away. I want to get people hooked in. I want to get people having fun right away. Maybe even start in media res, which means in the middle of things, I believe. I think that's French. But it's, like every James Bond movie starts in media res, right? It has this opening scene that a lot of times has nothing to do with the actual movie, but just starts with crazy things happening, Bond running for his life, people shooting at him, you're shoving popcorn in your pie hole as fast as you can. Like, that's the way to start a movie, right? You get it going. I hate those movies where you sit there for 20 minutes and listen to people talk to each other and, oh my God. So I don't want to start my game like that, right? I want it to start with something happening right away, like my murder mystery example I gave. I mean, yeah, I gave a chance for the PCs to roleplay in the beginning if they wanted, but basically, as soon as like that tapered off, or as soon as I got the feeling that they were ready to go, boom, someone screams outside, something's happening, something to deal with. It doesn't have to be combat. Although that's the obvious first choice. We're all used to action movies and that's how they do it. But it doesn't have to be. Any kind of tense situation where the PCs need to make decisions, the players need to roll some dice, spend some resources, that kind of thing. Get them going, get them in the game, get them seeing the system ASAP. I want to make the first adventure relatively straightforward. Again, because I might have new GMs, I might have new players. I'm assuming that I will have some GMs and or players who have played games like maybe D&D, but this is their first time playing Numenera, maybe even their first time of playing a more story-based game like this. Maybe I've got people coming from the World of Darkness or New World of Darkness games, and they're a bit more on the storytelling side. So, we don't know where people are coming from, but I want to make this first adventure pretty straightforward for new players or people coming from D&D or Pathfinder, so that they have lots of points of contact, so they can feel like, okay, I got this. This is cool. I know what's going on. But that said, I also want to add some interesting twists. Okay. I want to give them these points of contact with maybe games they've experienced before, or just their preconceptions if they're a new gamer. But then I want to challenge those preconceptions with some twists and show how Numenera is different from those other games, or different from what they expect or what they've seen before. I also, because of the particular story I want to tell, I want to start the PCs off strongly tied to the Order of Truth. I think I mentioned before, with my original playtest group that I'm running now, I actually started this with the Hidden Price. I did a one-shot of the Hidden Price. And when I did that, I did not do this. I suggested that they might want to be somehow affiliated with the Order of Truth, like my very passive way of, instead of just saying, hey, you guys need to be tied to the Order of Truth, which I learned that's what you need to do. You got to ask for what you want. Don't be like wishy-washy. Because what happened is some of my PCs didn't really have a strong tie to the Order of Truth. One of them even was like antagonistic to the Order of Truth. That was actually my wife. I obviously did not communicate to her very well what I was wanting to do, and her character was all anti-science and anti-Order of Truth and everything, and we made it work. We kind of spun it like she was going to try to infiltrate the Order of Truth and destroy them from the inside out. But I realized, I was like, this isn't working. I gotta just come out and say, hey, you guys, you need to either be part of the Order of Truth or you want to be part of the Order of Truth. Like, that's just the conceit of this adventure.
As we play, it can change if you want, but that's where we're starting out. And any story you tell, you're probably going to have some guidelines like that when the PCs make their characters of, hey, for this story to work, this is kind of where we need to start. Now, where it goes from there is up to you. You have player agency, but this is where we're starting. I would, at some point, like the PCs to enter the Westwood for a couple reasons. One, I just think the Westwood is awesome. I love forests. I love trees. When I was D&D player, I was huge on the elves, and I want them to explore the Westwood some. I want to have some cool things in the Westwood. And also, I want them to have a hopefully peaceful encounter with the Kalovas very early in the campaign, preferably in the first adventure. I would like this to happen. And for the first adventure, I've decided that I want to give them a discovery to investigate, because what is more Numenera than investigating a discovery? That's what the game's all about. And I want this to happen in the Westwood because, like I just said, I love the Westwood and I want to get them in there. And this way I can also bring in the Kalovas. I also want to have an Eon priest in the town who can serve as a mentor for the PCs and also a connection to the Order. Presumably some of the PCs are going to be members of the Order of Truth, and the other PCs are going to be people who want to become members of the Order of Truth. So one of their motivations, their character motivations at the beginning of the story, is for those in the Order, they want to gain standing and impress their superiors so that they can get promoted within the Order. And those who want to join the Order, they also want to impress people in the Order so that they can join. And so to have that possible, I need there to be an Eon priest in town that they can impress. And I've also decided that I want to limit it to one priest, even though in the Steadfast there would normally be more. But this is going to be a very small town, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, kind of. And I just want there to be one, again, to kind of keep the scale small and to just have this one representative of the Order of Truth that the PCs can interact with. And there's also some other things I'd like to do with this priest. I'm thinking maybe he's estranged from the Order, or for some other reason wants to gain or regain standing in it. And I'm going to talk more about this the next episode, but I mentioned before that one of the themes I'm interested in with this campaign is the Order of Truth itself and the crusades against the Gaians, and what are the moral and ethical ramifications of that, and what is the Order of Truth really? Is it really this altruistic organization pursuing scientific truth, that this idea that we're sold, is it really true? And so having an Eon priest as their mentor who maybe disagrees with some of these things that the Order is doing is a great way for me to get the PCs thinking about, or the players thinking about these things right at the beginning. So yeah, I'm thinking about that too. More on that next week or next episode. And also this NPC can send the PCs on their first adventure and also possibly provide hooks for future adventures. So again, I don't know if I've mentioned this before. I think I have, but I want to, for this first adventure for the campaign, I want it to be a little more structured, a little more linear. Again, I may have new GMs, I may have new players, and it's just the beginning of a campaign. Always, you got to get some momentum, right? There's no momentum. There's no character history. It's like the pilot episode of a TV show. It's always kind of awkward, right? So a good way to help with that is to have a more structured first adventure and then let it open up after there. So now that I have my goals, the next thing I like to do, I'm super organized. I'm a list man, if you haven't figured that out. The next thing I like to do is I like to look at those goals and decide what I need to do to achieve them, and decide, where I need to spend some time and effort. So I made a to-do list for my first adventure. The first thing on my to-do list is develop the town. I want to create a new, unique town for this adventure. I want a place of my own in the Ninth World that's completely mine, of my own creation. So find a place on the map, stick my town there, and develop it. And some things I'm going to think about when developing my town is the weird in the town. Got to have some weird, right? Places of interest, NPCs, rumors, and adventure seeds that can be dug up in the town by the PCs. The way of life and culture of the people of the town, and descriptions of various places in the town, descriptions of just the town itself, descriptions of people in the town. I've talked a lot about this, so I'm doing all this with my town. Also a name for the town. You kind of have a name, right? That's the hardest part. And also, I need to come up with a discovery in the Westwood for them to explore. And again, I want to come up with something completely original. This is all original stuff in this campaign. I'm not going to use stuff from Monty Cook Games, Adventures, or Supplements or whatever. Come up with my own stuff. And also, I want to think of an interesting way to introduce the Calovas to the PCs. I want to try to do it in such a way that I can present them at the very least as neutral or even as protagonists. I don't want to introduce them in such a way that it seems like I'm presenting them as these are the enemy or these are monsters. I want it to be preferably in a neutral way so the PCs can make their own decision, but at the very least so that they see them as a fellow sentient race and not just as some bucket of XP to kick over. And then I need encounters. I need some encounters within my discovery, within my facility I'm going to come up with, and encounters with some of the NPCs in the town and stuff like that. So that's my goals with the adventure and my to-do list. I have a lot of work to do. It's not that much. It's fun, right? It's a labor of love. I wouldn't do this if I didn't like it. But some of the people, like some of the reactions to like my prep, they're like, oh, that's too much work. I would never do. It's like, well, I enjoy it. That's why I'm a GM. That's why I'm not a player, because I enjoy the prep. I enjoy coming up with stories. I enjoy coming up with NPCs and places. And that's what I'd love. I mean, I get to play lots of characters as GM, right? I get to play tons of characters. And I prefer that too. I'd much rather play 20 characters in a gaming session than just play one. But playing is fun too. But if I could only do one, if someone held a gun to my head and said, Lex, from this day forward, you can either only play or only GM, and I'm going to have a sniper bead on you the whole time for the rest of your life. And the moment, if you say you're going to play, the moment you GM, I'm going to put a bullet in your brain. What do you choose? I would be a GM. I mean, it would not even take a second or a heartbeat of thought. I'd be like, I'm a GM. I'll forswear playing. I promise I won't do it. Don't shoot me.
Coming up next on the Obsidian Monolith.
So next week on the Obsidian Monolith, I am going to get through all this stuff I just said I was going to do on my to-do list and tell you how I'm going to achieve those goals I set for the first adventure. I will share some details about the logging town I came up with in Navarine for this adventure and my ideas for a discovery in the Westwood. And I'll also share the encounters I came up with, the flow of the adventure, and all that good stuff. So I apologize that I didn't get all the way through the first adventure stuff today, but I thought it was really important to talk about the stuff I talked about at the top of the show about how I run a game and how I prepare, because this campaign is like a long-term thing, right? I mean, it's going to be a while before I get all the way through this podcast and you can just take this campaign and run with it. So for those of you that need help right now, there you go. So maybe you can be kind and be a good citizen. And if you see someone online asking about advice on how to run and prepare for a Numenera session, and if you think I gave good advice, tell them to listen to episode 4 of the Obsidian Monolith. And hopefully this will help them out. And thank you so much. Well, that's going to wrap up Game Master's Journey. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Please go find me on Google+. You can just search for Lex Starwalker. And please join the Game Master's Journey Google+ community. You can find a link to it on our website at starwalkerstudios.com in the Game Master's Journey show notes. And please follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please call the voicemail 626-LEX-GMI1. And again, please visit our website, starwalkerstudios.com. There you can find the show notes for this show. You can find helpful links to our Google+ community, and you can also find our other podcasts that we put out. So once again, I thank you for joining me on my journey as a game master, and I look forward to coming back next week. So until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.